When George Washington took office as the first president in 1789, the United States was a fragile experiment in democracy, a form of government which had been spurred since the fall of Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars. A great idea is only as good as the leader behind it. The true value lies in who drives the vision forward, not who initially conceived of it. Without a doubt, America is not what it is today without the man who would serve honorably as this nation's first executive officer. But that job wasn't something that he sought. Following his success in the American Revolution, Washington retired to his farm under the belief that a standing army is a natural threat to civil liberties. He reluctantly came out of his self-imposed exile only after Shays' rebellion had made it crystal clear that the Articles of Confederation weren't up to the task of governing the nation that he had fought so valiantly to create. After effectively chairing the Constitutional Convention, Washington's colleagues asked him to run for the newly created position of president. But the former general denied any interest. Pressed with whether or not he would accept the job if it were bestowed upon him, he refused to answer. Despite his reluctance, Washington was appointed to the position via a unanimous vote, with John Adams of Massachusetts being selected as the nation's first vice president, courtesy of the fact that he was the second highest vote getter. The two men were both staunch Federalists, meaning that they believed in the concept of a strong central government. Both men, however, would have steadfastly denied that such a designation played a part in any of their official decision-making. Political parties, or factions as they were referred to in the Federalist Papers, were widely regarded as an evil concept, which would inevitably result in individuals putting the accumulation of party power over what was in the fledgling nation's best interest. In this manner, George Washington's steadfast belief in democratic principles may be the only reason that we continue to remain a democratic republic to this day. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed for students taking the AP US History course. This episode covers the first major concept embedded within period 4, 1800 to 1848. A modern major general creates a modern mass democracy. George Washington was 57 years old when he adopted the mantle of president. He had already lived a full life, which had ensured his place within the history books. As a 22-year-old serving beneath the British within a Virginia militia, Washington's imprudent actions set fire to the world, sparking the 7 Years' War, commonly referred to in North America as the French and Indian War. He accepted the commission of head of the Continental Army during the American Revolution as a 43-year-old. I can't speak to personal experience, but I imagine that fighting 8 years of mostly losing battles ages someone quite a bit. Lacking a clear guidance for his new job, Washington adopted a number of the conventions that had been set up and established by the failed Articles of Confederation. He signaled his belief in the new government's priority by setting up a 3-man cabinet, with Alexander Hamilton serving as the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson becoming the first Secretary of State, and Henry Knox being appointed as the first Secretary of War. In Washington's mind, the purpose of government was threefold: steer the economy, guide relations with foreign nations, and remain prepared in the advent of war. Hamilton wanted him to go significantly further, employing President Washington to don the mantle of America's own King George. Yet the former general, who would have been intimately aware of the benefits that came with clearly structured top-down designated authority, told any who would listen that he sought to show the world how to be a president in a world of kings. Pressed to define the court system, which had been left quite vague in the Constitution, Washington refused to weigh in, proclaiming that the Constitution said that it was Congress's job. The legislative body responded with the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established a federal district court in each state, as well as 3 circuit appeals court and the Supreme Court. Despite the apparent action, it was clear to many that the nation's first branch was ahead of its skis, as the Bill of Rights was only added to the Constitution in 1791. These 10 amendments were designed to safeguard fundamental personal rights. They also served to ease anti-federalist fears that Washington, both as capital and president, would merely reform the oppressive national government that the Revolution had overthrown. Never one to back down from a challenge, however, Alexander Hamilton aggressively pursued a strong Federalist agenda from his seat as Treasury Secretary. Continuing his tradition of writing like he was running out of time, Hamilton issued 3 major reports which all served the expansion of federal power. In the 1790 Public Credit Report, the Founding Father argued that the nation's government ought to immediately pay off all war debts, including those incurred by the states, which amounted to an insanely high $22 million. It wasn't done out of the kindness of A. Ham's heart, however, as he was the first to express the idea that debt matters little as long as the economy remains in a state of continuous growth. Today, that logic underpins the concept of borrowing from your future self to pay for the priorities of today. Deficit hawks immediately flew into an outrage, with the ever-eccentric Patrick Henry proclaiming that such actions would prove fatal to the existence of American liberty. Hamilton bought off Henry's allies by agreeing to the newly created permanent national capital to be built along the Potomac River, close enough so suspicious Southerners would be able to keep a close eye on the government's actions. Thomas Jefferson was in the room where that deal happened, allowing the establishment of a national bank on a 20-year charter. It was in this fight that Hamilton revealed his belief in an implied doctrine powers concept in regard to the Constitution, pointing out that the charter grants the federal government the ability to pass all laws that are necessary and proper to carrying out the Constitution's orders. Jefferson and his chief political ally, James Madison, were so vehemently opposed to the creation of a federal financial institution that they appealed straight to Washington, who, in a nod to compromise, obliged Hamilton to find a way to pay for all of it without massively running up a deficit. That requirement set the stage for Washington's most tumultuous moment during his 8-year run as president. Tariffs remain quite popular when they are levied as protective measures. An area which produces quality steel, for instance, seeks out protective tariffs which nudge the price of foreign steel just slightly above its national competitors. As long as the quality is of similar fashion, buyers will then turn to the U.S.-produced product due to the fact that it is now cheaper than its foreign alternative. Hamilton, however, didn't believe in protective tariffs. He levied tariffs as taxes. That was a fateful decision that would inevitably drive up the price of a good which lacked competitors. The consumers would pay more for their product, with a portion of it heading into the pockets of Uncle Sam. Hamilton targeted foreign manufactured goods in order to secure 4 to 5 million of the sum that he needed to establish the bank. Then he proceeded to levy a duty on whiskey which was distilled in the United States in order to secure another million. Overall, the policy worked to perfection. Whenever American trade increased, customs revenue rose steadily in conjunction, allowing Hamilton to consistently work towards paying down the national debt which he had created. The tax on whiskey, however, unduly harmed certain segments of society. Farmers in western Pennsylvania rose up in frustration in 1794 as the tax had cut demand for the corn whiskey that the farmers distilled locally before haggling with eastern manufacturers for a price which they deemed to be in their best interest. With the price of whiskey being artificially elevated, more and more Americans were switching to other forms of alcohol. Likening their fate to that of their colonial forefathers, the farmers of western Pennsylvania rose up against federal tax collectors, proclaiming the ideals of the ongoing French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. These had been the very ideals that Washington had asked his men to lay their lives on the line for. Indeed, the American Revolution had directly inspired the French Revolution. Although the King of France had originally aided the colonies in order to get back at England for snatching Canada during the French and Indian War, the debts incurred as well as the lobbying done by enlightened Americans, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, had inspired the calls for revolutionary change on the other side of the Atlantic. How Washington chose to deal with the protesters would establish a precedent moving forward. Would he side with his heart, which must have been reaching out to comfort those whose lives were negatively impacted by the government's endless need for cash? Or would he back the rule of law that had been established by a group of men who had been democratically elected by the small group of individuals who were allowed at this point in time to vote? He chose to crush the dissent, organizing a 12,000-man strong militia in order to disperse the angry mob. He proclaimed the protesters' act as treasonous and warned all persons whomsoever against aiding, abetting, and comforting the perpetrators of the aforesaid treasonable acts, and do require all officers and other citizens, according to their respective duties and the laws of the land, to exert their utmost endeavors to prevent and suppress such dangerous proceedings. Future presidents Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln would each draw upon the Whiskey Rebellion's precedent to threaten military action against the American people during their own nullification crises. That proved to be the biggest crisis that faced the Washington administration, which in part resulted in a number of individuals petitioning the president to accept a third term in office. Washington steadfastly refused, delivering what was another precedent-setting speech in the form of his farewell address. The nation's foremost founding father decreed that future leaders needed to avoid segmenting into political factions, be wary of entanglement with foreign nations, which could draw the young nation into a war, and proclaiming that no man should hold on to power for more than 2 terms. In his mind, it was critical that new leaders would have the opportunity to guide the nation. Thus, the election of 1796 would prove to be the first truly contested election for the nation's highest office, the winner of which would have to deal with the upset indigenous population of the Northwest Territory, an issue that Washington had stirred up, but left entirely unfinished. Washington's native policy can be best described as incomplete. The American Revolution was caused in part by the British insistence that colonists don't travel past the Proclamation line of 1763. With the British removed from the equation, there was little that Washington could do to stem the tide. In fact, he stated for the record that nothing short of a Chinese wall or a line of troops will restrain the encroachment of settlers upon Indian territory. Incredibly, American families settled as much territory between 1790 and 1810 as they had during the entire colonial era. Natives obviously resisted the encroachment to the best of their ability, with Little Turtle of the Miami tribe defeating the two expeditionary forces sent across 1791 and 1792. But the American settlers kept coming, and eventually the native forces were beaten down to the point that they were forced to sign lopsided treaties for their ancestral lands. The guarantees weren't worth the paper that they were written on, a fact that became commonplace during the treaty era. Henry Knox, Washington's Secretary of War, favored assimilating the natives into America, but the indigenous peoples resisted it, as assimilation wasn't compatible with their culture. Knox, for instance, wanted the natives to abandon their traditional ways of life in favor of becoming farmers. Young native warriors resisted the rules imposed upon them as they had grown up in a world that valued warriors, where conflict was the only way to convince others that you deserved consideration for a leadership position. Lastly, the new American teachings devalued women, an absolute non-starter for a number of tribes that were at the minimum matrilineal. Their resistance to assimilation resulted in conflict, which then led to loss, with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix taking away most of the native land holdings in Pennsylvania and New York. The once powerful Iroquois Confederacy found themselves suddenly confined to reservations. Subsequent treaties then pushed the natives out of most of the Ohio Territory. In 1794, in the Battle of the Fallen Timbers, U.S. General Mad Anthony Wayne subdued the largest and last threatening tribe in the region, paving the way for the critically important Treaty of Greenville, which acknowledged the natives' original right to land. This compromise might fly in the face of what you imagined was happening during this period, but such an acknowledgement was necessary for the quote-unquote sales of land to be legitimized. In other words, the treaties were only valid if the natives had prior ownership. This treaty still has ramifications today, as it was the first time that the U.S. government publicly acknowledged the status of Native Americans as a people who were beneath their protection. The opening of such vast land holdings fundamentally changed the nature of the United States. No region was spared. 21 leading men of Virginia bought up 1/4 of all of Kentucky and Tennessee, while the rest of the state was primarily made up of squatters, creating a lasting legacy of inequality. The Deep South, comprising Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, was settled by slave-holding plantation owners, entrenching a legacy of racism that some would argue still remains prevalent today. New England remained overcrowded, as new settlers from overseas tended to not bypass the manufacturing hub of America. Unable to compete with the geographical advantages of the South and Midwest, these Americans began to innovate their way to success, setting the stage for the first industrial revolution, which would begin its sectional divide with the South. The Midwest, which had slavery ruled out in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, was settled by men and women who had already decided that slavery was against humanity's best interests. A number of noted abolitionists would be cultivated from the 5 states that connect to the Great Lakes. This doesn't mean that this area was perfect, however, as financial differences were prominent. Nearly half of Ohio's residents were landless squatters, while the top 1% of Ohioans owned a full quarter of the territory. John Adams won the right to fix these problems in the 1796 election, defeating Thomas Jefferson. Although both men had been key figures in the Washington administration, Hamilton's actions had split the nation into factions, with Thomas Jefferson forming the Democratic Republicans, a party to oppose the Federalists, men like John Adams. The new party appealed to Western settlers and farmers who were proclaimed by Jefferson to be the chosen people of God, by taking up positions opposing Hamilton's National Bank, Washington's excise tax on whiskey, as well as an assortment of other tariffs. The Democratic Republicans also split with the Federalists over the concept of federal power, proclaiming loudly and proudly their steadfast belief in the existence of a states' rights doctrine. The creation of the first-party system resulted in a contested election, but the Federalists retained power. Jefferson's second-place finish, however, resulted in his ascension to the vice presidency, as the 12th Amendment had yet to be written. This meant that the president and vice president not only hadn't run for office together, they possessed diametrically opposed worldviews. Adams would later proclaim on his deathbed that his only regret was that Jefferson still lives, oblivious to the fact that his vice president had passed from this earth mere hours earlier on the same day. Adams also had a quite memorable quote on the office of the vice president, telling his wife that it was the most insignificant office ever invented by man. He thus had little concern about shoving Jefferson to the side to continue Washington's pro-British foreign policy. John Jay, a prominent founding father who would go on to become the first Chief Justice of the newly formed Supreme Court, was dispatched to England to deal with the impressment of U.S. sailors, as both the French and English were seizing neutral U.S. ships during the French Revolution. Jay's treaty is a remarkable failure, as he not only allowed for the trafficking of our nation's sailors, he agreed to pay back pre-revolutionary colonial debts. Adams also aided the British by funneling money and supplies to the Haitian revolutionaries rising up against their French overlords. Adams' administration, however, was unable to get out of its own way. Unable to remember which Frenchman had been mentioned in soliciting a bribe, the nation's second president found himself embroiled in the XYZ affair. Faced with criticism from all sides, Adams cracked down, passing a series of laws which empowered the presidency at the expense of the people. His Naturalization Act extended the time period that it took to earn citizenship from 5 to 14 years. His Alien Act, passed in 1789, authorized the president to deport foreigners at will, while the Sedition Act prohibited all insults and malicious attacks on the president or members of Congress. The Supreme Court, which had yet to define itself, incredibly remained silent on the Sedition Act, which blatantly undercuts the protections guaranteed by the First Amendment. With the courts unable to act, Jefferson took initiative, convincing the Kentucky and Virginia legislators to nullify the Sedition Act, which had been used to jail more than 20 newspaper editors and politicians. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions asserted the states had the right to nullify laws of their choosing. A confrontation was looming, but Jefferson's victory in the election of 1800 allowed him to repeal some while shelving other parts of Adams's legacy. Adams could have done more to stay in power, as France's continued impressment of U.S. sailors gave him the opportunity to wag the dog by proclaiming war in order to get voters to rally around the flag. This election between the incumbent president and his sitting vice president was a no-holds-barred affair, with both candidates exploiting every election loophole in their bid for victory. Jefferson carried 73% of the vote, as a low turnout in Virginia and Pennsylvania aided him, along with the benefits in the South accrued by the 3/5 compromise. Thus, the slave-owning, self-proclaimed French admirer became the nation's third president. At least that is what Jefferson assumed would happen when the votes were tallied. However, a clever move devised by his Democratic-Republican Party backfired on him. Seeking to prevent his own vice president from undermining him in the same way that he had treated Adams, Jefferson ran alongside Aaron Burr, with an understanding that Burr would settle for the nation's second highest office. It was here that Alexander Hamilton would rise up once again to meddle in the affairs of his country. With the Electoral College tied, the official vote was thrown to the House of Representatives, with each state receiving an equal vote share. Hamilton manufactured a tie, not between his preferred candidate John Adams, but between the two Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The gambit was designed to create a political compromise, with Hamilton informing Jefferson that he would only relent upon receiving the Virginians' word that he would maintain the Federalist fiscal system, ensure American neutrality regarding France, and continue Adams's program of Navy modernization. Jefferson, however, steadfastly refused to enter into the Oval Office with one hand tied behind his back. Vote after vote, the two allies remained tied. With no end in sight, two groups started to get itchy. First was Aaron Burr, who had risen from relative nothingness to become a major player within the Capitol. He began to tell congressional aides that he would take the deal offered to Jefferson, the man whom he was supposed to be running with. Secondly was the state of Virginia, which began to raise a militia in order to send a strong signal that they might be willing to march on the Capitol in order to see their state's resident ascend to the throne. Fearful that the Republic wouldn't make it to a third president, Hamilton and his allies relented, with A. Ham proclaiming that Jefferson was the lesser of two evils. In part because of the bombastic statements made during the time period, Burr would challenge his former friend to a duel in 1804, while Burr was still the sitting vice president of the United States. For now, however, he slotted in as Jefferson's vice president, the man whom he had just attempted to throw under the bus in his own ambitious bid to rise above the station that life had allotted him. It would prove to be a recurring theme in his life. Jefferson was indeed, as Hamilton conceded, a man of principle. Although he had been unwilling to agree to Hamilton's demands, he largely kept the Federalist fiscal system in check, and not only continued the modernization of the military, but put it to use against pirates off of the Barbary coast in North Africa, embarking on America's first war over the president's refusal to pay their tribute demands. But those were the only places where he didn't pull an about-face on the Washington establishment. Hailing his victory as the Revolution of 1800, Jefferson worked to shrink Washington's footprints while handing off responsibility to the states. He eliminated most taxes, reduced the number of years for immigrants to become citizens, and shelved the Alien and Sedition Acts. he actively supported further westward expansion, creating provisions that would form the basis for the nation's public school system. He was also gifted the opportunity to agree to the Louisiana Purchase, after Napoleon had calculated that it wasn't worth the financial cost, as well as the cost in blood, sweat, and tears that were necessary to retake Haiti after Toussaint Louverture, known in the Caribbean as Black Napoleon, had completed the world's only successful slave uprising. Jefferson had initiated the purchase of a small patch of land, but was stunned to find out that Napoleon was willing to part with all of France's land holdings. He was immediately fearful that another buyer such as Spain, or in the worst-case scenario, England, would place a hostile nation at the back of his young nation. Disgusted as he must have been with himself, he accepted Hamilton's belief that the Constitution offered up implied powers, one of which was the purchase of new land via treaties. The land was so vast, however, that Jefferson merely began its exploration, hiring Meriwether Lewis to lead William Clark and the Corps of Discovery to traverse the unknown. Jefferson was a slave owner with openly racist views regarding men and women of African descent. Like many quote-unquote owners, Jefferson took sexual liberties with the women beneath his control, particularly Sally Hemings. All of her 6 children were light-skinned and bore a strong resemblance to Jefferson. 3 of them would go on to live out their lives within the white society of Virginia, a likely nod to their parentage. Historian Stephen Ambrose points out that the nation's 3rd president didn't harbor the same racist beliefs regarding the indigenous peoples of the Americas, men and women whom he referred to as noble savages. Ambrose tells us that he thought the only difference between Indians and white men was religion and the savage behavior of the Indians, which was caused by the environment in which the Indians lived. On the other hand, never did he say that the perceived shortcomings of enslaved black men and women, such as laziness and thievery, were caused by their conditions as slaves. Lewis and Clark were to introduce the natives to their new overlords, generously handing out gifts of medals, beads, and American flags, while encouraging the tribal chiefs to travel to Washington to meet the great white father of their nation. It never came to pass, but Jefferson kicked around some unique ideas for the natives of the Great Plains, suggesting at one point that they could become employees of the federal government, hunting buffalo and other game animals for the benefit of their new bosses. Lewis and Clark succeeded in part because of the unlikely contributions of York, William Clark's slave, and Sacagawea, the wife of a French trader whom they picked up just before crossing the Bitterroots on the leeward side of the Rockies. The expedition was at their lowest point in that very moment, having eaten all of their ponies while acknowledging the fact that there was no mythical waterway that would provide a northwest passage across the North American continent. It was at this critical moment that a war party of the Shoshones came upon them, with the band's leader incredibly recognizing his sister Sacagawea, who had been taken from his tribe when she was just a youth. The unplanned reunion would prove to be the saving grace for the expedition, which refueled in order to finish their trek to the Pacific Ocean and then return back home. Jefferson's time in office coincided with the Second Great Awakening, another period in our history when the evangelizing nature of Christianity perked up to recruit waves of new members. Revivalists crisscrossed the country, proclaiming that the Christian God promised salvation to any and all who followed his teachings. This moment continued to democratize religion among America's Protestant adherents. Unlike in France, where the Catholic Church made up one of the three estates or pillars of the French government, the Second Great Awakening emphasized the importance of having a personal and private relationship with God. A consecrated priest didn't have to be there to facilitate the coupling. One of Thomas Jefferson's lasting influences on America's religious institutions is his bedrock principle of separation of church and state. Rather than a legally enshrined position, however, that American tradition flows from Jefferson's words in a thank you letter to the Danbury Baptist congregation for their political support. 50 years after the letter had been written, historians republished the document, which had proclaimed that a strong wall must be built to separate church from state. Such was necessary in the minds of the revivalists of the Second Great Awakening, who were seeing converts join at record highs during this time period. Although it would take time for the seeds to awaken, the increased church membership from this period would go on to form the backbone of the abolitionists and temperance movements in the coming decades. Jefferson easily won his re-election in 1804, making sure to oversee the passage of the 12th Amendment, which ensured that presidents and vice presidents would run on a clearly defined joint ticket. Jefferson had undercut his John Adams, only to then be saddled with Aaron Burr as his own second-in-command. Adams's words that it was the most insignificant office ever imagined by man were proving to be quite true. Burr was dropped from the ticket in favor of New York's George Clinton, a man who would go on to retain the vice presidency for a second term beneath Jefferson's successor James Madison. The man whom he replaced, Aaron Burr, attempted to run for the open position of governor of New York, but left for the West after losing the vote. The literal duel with Hamilton and the public spat with Jefferson had left him an outcast in the country which he had helped to found. No one could predict what would come next, as Burr was credibly accused of attempting to steal parts of the Louisiana Territory as well as a portion of Spanish lands in order to form a new nation which would be powerful enough to declare war on Washington, D.C. After a co-conspirator produced a series of letters, Burr was arrested and put on trial for treason, escaping the headsman's block after the Supreme Court found that although he had been guilty of conspiracy against the United States, he had not yet taken any formal steps towards treason. Still, his public life was over, and his name adjoining Benedict Arnold as synonymous with the word traitor began. The other thorn in Jefferson's side was John Marshall, the second Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall immediately took the reins and defined the powers of our third branch of government. Knowing that the power transition was inevitable, John Adams had embarked on the nation's first ever midnight judicial appointments. Working by candlelight, Adams used the Judiciary Act of 1801 to appoint 16 new judgeships. These Federalist-appointed judges were intended to be a bulwark against the Democratic Republicans. The intended appointment of William Marbury was never delivered, however, as Jefferson's ally James Madison first ran the appointment by his future boss. Marbury sued for his job, and in the landmark decision of Marbury v. Madison, the Marshall Court decreed that the Supreme Court alone had the power to interpret the Constitution. The newly formed process of judicial review served to reverse the Judiciary Act of 1801, wiping out Adams' efforts to sabotage the Jefferson administration. Although that decision went Jefferson's way, the Marshall Court massively expanded the power of the federal government. After Maryland attempted to tax the national bank's headquarters into bankruptcy, the Supreme Court decreed that the federal government had the ability to do anything that was, quote, necessary and proper to fulfill its role. The case made Hamilton's assumptions of implied powers official government protocol. When competing steamboats argued in front of the court in Gibbons v. Ogden, Marshall made sure that the federal government remained supreme regarding interstate commerce. And in Fletcher v. Peck, Marshall's court limited state power, bolstered vested property rights, and promoted the development of a national capitalist economy. The last part matched Jefferson's ideals, as he made it easier for Western settlers to purchase land, reducing the price from $2 an acre to just $1.25, while easing credit terms and making it possible for illegal squatters to officially buy up their homesteads. Policies from the fiscal conservative Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin managed to significantly reduce the national debt, which he had proclaimed an evil of the first magnitude. After 2 terms, the American people enthusiastically continued Jefferson's revolution by electing his Secretary of State, James Madison. Little did the American people realize that America's winning streak was about to come to an abrupt end, as a foreign power would invade American soil for the first time, burning Washington, D.C. to the ground. We will examine the Madison administration in more detail, along with the War of 1812, in the next episode.